Okay, so we're recording today. The timestamp is August 23rd at 2:05 Eastern Time. I'm here with Nick St. Louis, and we are going to talk about the anatomy of podcasting. So I'm Ruth O'Donnell, and I am part of the leadership team at the Foot Nerd program. And Nick and I, so I want to just talk first, like why we are recording this, because I talk to well, first of all, it's like really kind of geared toward our Foot Nerd community, who are people who are health leaders and guides in our communities, and we want to hear their stories. So we want to encourage our Foot Nerds to start talking with each other and people in their communities in the podcast format. I have the ability and the luxury of talking with each individual Foot Nerd so often, and then like when they graduate, I get to hear their stories and read their papers, and each of these humans has like an amazing story to tell, and they have something special to offer. And many of them have expressed, many of you have expressed interest in podcasting, but seem to need like maybe more structure and also encouragement to get over the fears, which there's that too. So Nick's has a lot of experience in podcasting, and he has, so we've been talking about this for a while in our meetings about how can we like encourage the Foot Nerds to start along this process. So we came up with the idea to record the anatomy of a podcast. And so Nick, so we want to try to like, I want to try to like tease out Nick's story, like why the hell did you start, like why did you get the idea to record the first podcast? We want to hear like the background about it, and like I also want to hear, I just want to hear like what were you afraid of, and then like what inspired you to get over the fear. I guess that's the first thing, right? Because the first thing is like, what do I have to say? Who do I want to say it to? And how am I going to get over the fear of like actually putting this out into the world? So can we start there?
Yes, that's a great place to start. And I think what you just said about just getting clear of like, what am I going to say and who am I going to say it to? Just getting clarity on that gives you a lot more confidence to be like, yeah, this is actually important. And, other people may have said that, but other people aren't me. And there's only one of me. And so my story, my perspective, the way I explain this is going to be different from everyone else, as long as I don't try and copy everyone else. And so I think rule number one with podcasting is like, just be who you are. And that's it. That's a really big part of it. And before I ever recorded podcasts with TFC or with other people who invited me on, I was a big fan of podcasts. I've been a fan of podcasts since like probably first year of university. So like a decade of solid, or more than a decade of solid being a fan of podcasts, listening to podcasts, and almost unconsciously absorbing the anatomy of a good conversation. Because there's some podcasts that you listen to, you're like, that was a weird one, that wasn't that good, and there's some that you're like, that was amazing, it was an authentic conversation. And I find the medium of two humans having an unedited conversation together, who are both curious and who both have some sort of information to share, even if it's just like a stand-up comic sharing how they come up with their bits. Like I find that really interesting, and I find I connect to those people. Whereas sometimes I'll even just lie down, listen to a podcast, and I will actually, this sounds weird, but I will look up pictures of the people in the podcast. I'll just lie down with my eyes closed, and I will imagine them having a conversation in front of me. I know that might sound weird, but like that gives me, it almost puts me into that place where I'm observing them having that conversation. I think that's a really interesting and beautiful way of learning. So yeah.
So okay. So when I'm sweating right now, just even thinking about the idea of podcast, because it was only because of you, like when you were like, we should get on and like record, like, and I was like, well, what do people know who you are? We had some ideas. And the first time I was like, oh, hell no. But I think like you were saying, so how do you describe authentic? Because, like you said, just be yourself. Like that's obviously easier said than done, because most of us don't really like ourselves too much, or like we're super self-critical, right? So that's like a whole other pillar of health on how to get comfortable in your skin. And I'm assuming that you don't have to be completely like at ease with yourself in order to overcome the barriers to like get on and talk about something that you want to talk about. So I'm assuming like the passion has to be there for the subject that you want to talk about. And as Foot Nerds, like I often talk with Foot Nerds, like how nobody at the dinner party ever wants to talk about the stuff that we want to talk about, like feet and stuff. And it doesn't resonate or make sense. So in my brain, I'm like, well, and also it's in the middle of a pandemic when we first started recording, and I'm like, these are my friends and we have stuff to talk about. So I'm gonna talk about it. And Jeff Shub just on Saturday was talking about like how when a group of people that care enough about the same thing that you care about come together, then it's worthy of a conversation. So what do you say to overcoming fear, even when you don't really like love your voice, or maybe you don't even think you have anything to say, but there's something inside you that's like, I really would like to try that.
Yeah, I think you almost have to start with something along the lines of, I have this information that I've gained throughout my life, that I've picked up throughout my life experience. This information has given me huge benefit in my health process. This information is not common knowledge. Therefore, to let my fear stop me from sharing this important information with people who could potentially benefit from it means that the fear has to be checked and acknowledged, but the motivation to share information you deem important and relevant to people has to be higher, has to get to a higher threshold to overcome your fear. And like, the other thing that I think is really important with the fear thing is like, a lot of people fear being criticized, or fear saying the wrong things, or fear being proven wrong. And if every time you say something, you're doing it with an open curiosity to always, like, I have conversations with people who disagree with me because I want to be proven wrong. I want to see what other people who disagree with me, what information do they have that I might not have come across. And so if all you're doing is sharing where you currently are and freely admit that you reserve the right to change your mind as soon as better information crosses your path, and part of this path is to actively seek out people who might not completely agree with you, then there's no fear of ever being wrong, because being wrong is the path to learning. And so when you are wrong, it's actually a good thing, right? You start to look at being wrong as like, wow, I'm evolving my understanding by having these conversations, or by working through concepts. Like the amount of times that I go into a concept for a podcast and I start researching and learning, and I realize how much I didn't know, or how some of the perspectives that I held maybe weren't completely accurate because I just hadn't researched it really intensely, right? And as a rule of thumb for me, every hour of recording a podcast usually has about 2 hours of time preparing in some way. And that's not just like hardcore research. It's also like writing down my thoughts, getting clear on how am I going to explain this in a really simple way without sidestepping some of the nuance that is really important, which is actually what's captivated best in a podcast, right? Like Instagram is not very good for communicate. There's such a lack of context and nuance. Podcasts are really the place to have conversations where you can touch on all the important points that make up, an idea. And so knowing you have valuable information that could benefit one person on planet Earth and help them through their process, and knowing that the podcast medium, I think being a fan of a podcast made me realize how much they resonated with me. And that's what made me want to do a podcast. And so if you've never listened to podcasts before, you might not have the threshold of seeing how powerful podcasts are to push you beyond the fear. But the reality is a lot of people listen to podcasts, and an uninterrupted podcast, I think, is much more powerful than a YouTube video, because it eliminates all of the side distractions of YouTube, of all the distractions. And so it is a powerful medium to relay a message. And so, yeah, I think no one should be forced to do a podcast that they don't want to do. But I think people underestimate how valuable what they have to say, if it's formatted well, and even their individual stories of how they came to have that information. That's really valuable. I think storytelling is like the most underestimated human learning technology that we just don't use anymore. And I think storytelling really resonates with the podcast medium.
Okay, so tell me a story, Nikki Pop, about your first podcast. Did you sweat?
I definitely sweated. It took me it was like a battle of, should I do this or should I not? No one's going to want this information. People aren't going to want to listen to it. I don't have the right audio equipment. That was a big one. It's like, I don't have the right speed. Like, it's funny how something that's really important will create the most resistance in your life to completing it. And so when I finally brought myself to doing a podcast, by the way, it took me 3 tries to get the podcast. Like the first 2.
One.
No. The three attempts. I made 3 attempts at doing a podcast before I actually committed to doing a podcast. The first one was called the Footcast, and they were just YouTube videos, and it just talked about different elements of foot health. I recorded them literally on my laptop in my bedroom, and I was just like, I'm just going to put this 20-minute thing out and see if anyone likes to listen to it. I don't even like hearing my own voice, so I doubt anyone will, but I'll do it anyway. And the exercise of doing that, and it was kind of unnatural too, because it was like a monologue, right? I'm just speaking to no one, which immediately was like, this seems weird. But I did that, and I wanted to do 10 episodes, and I got to like 5 episodes, and I was like, I can't do that anymore. Or like, I was easy to make excuses to not continue doing it. Then I tried.
Wait. Was the reason why after 5 episodes because it wasn't, you were by yourself and there needed to be another human, or like what was the reason why you're like, I can't do it like this?
Well, I don't know what excuses I made for myself at the time, but it was enough to get me to stop doing them. And I think there was something where I wasn't accountable, like I had to be self-accountable to recording these things. And the fact that I wasn't even speaking to another human, I was like, is this going to come off as real weird? And so I think those two things combined probably just created, and then I listened to a few of them and I'm like, the audio quality is garbage. Like, why would anyone listen to this? I was so critical of them that I thought other people would see the same thing and not listen to them. And so you're always going to be your toughest critic. But that was attempt number 1, and gave up. And attempt number 2 was I upgraded the equipment and I started doing podcasts. I think I started doing podcasts with Mike. This was pre-audio project. So this was like still taking a stab at this whole podcasting thing, knowing that I listen to podcasts. Podcasts are only getting more and more valuable as a learning medium or as a content medium. So I should probably do them. And then after like, I think I learned that the magic number is 13. If you get beyond 13, then there's a high likelihood you'll continue on with recording. I don't know where that number comes from, but I come across all these things. Yeah. And anyway, that and didn't end up working. Like I wasn't able to sustain that. And I created a bunch of excuses. I'll work. This isn't the important thing to work on. I should put my energy elsewhere, blah, blah, blah. And then at a certain point, I was like, you know what? Podcasting is unbelievably important. I have access to Mike and a bunch of other people to have great conversations. Like, I'm just going to spend a lot of money on audio recording equipment and give myself no choice but to commit to this. And I made a plan for like 20 weeks where it's like every week a podcast is going to be released. Here's the topic list for 20 weeks. Here's the breakdown of each topic list. And I just gave myself no choice. I planned it so deeply that I was like, all right, well, executing this is the easiest part. I've already done all the work. And turns out that was the secret ingredient, where it was just like, I took multiple attempts, failed a few times, was honest with myself with like, why didn't I keep going with this? It wasn't the excuses. The excuses I made were really convincing, right? And it's so easy to convince ourselves that we shouldn't do something, especially if it's really important, right? Like the resistance. Stephen Pressfield talks about the resistance. The most important projects in your life will carry the most resistance because they're the most important. And so then I started getting really enjoying podcasts. I loved doing them because it forced me to research topics that I wouldn't do that much research for otherwise. And I knew Mike was doing the same thing. And I was like, you know, I could just not research this and go into this with like a few notes, but I know Mike's done a lot of work preparing for this. So that kept me accountable. Knowing that he put in the work kept me accountable. And also deepened my understanding on huge amounts of topics related to physio based on our shop talks. So yeah, it was a long time. It was like a long process. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to do a podcast and then start doing them. It was like multiple attempts. It was hard. And hopefully what I can convey today is like the little things I learned and picked up along the way, getting to the point beyond the breaking point of being able to sustain it. And also just little things that I've learned have been really helpful for me from a self-evaluation standpoint of like the craft of having good conversations that other people can relate to and want to listen to. So we'll cover some of that stuff.
Yeah, so let's start with that. So we have like, we've kind of covered, like, we have a lot to unpack in a short amount of time, but like let's go from like the beginner podcast to, because you started a while ago, a few years ago now. You also were listening to podcasts for a long time. And this is kind of like your thing. I mean, like you love podcasting, but let's just say we want to, there are some foot nerds who like don't necessarily want to make podcasting a big deal. Like, let's talk about like the very basic equipment, the time, because like we've talked a lot about, I really was interested when we first started talking, because I was thinking 30 minutes or 20 minutes seems like more than enough time than anybody has like the attention span for. And you gave me like a lot of really interesting feedback about like what is like unpacking a 90-minute podcast, like the different times So let's start with like the basic equipment, like beginner baby podcasting. Like, what do you have to do?
Yeah, and there's not, I mean, in the age of Zoom, where people are kind of automatically upgrading some of their audio visual equipment, because this is just, you can't make the omelet back into the eggs. Like, we are in a place where we're going to connect with each other digitally more and more frequently, and equipment is constantly getting cheaper and better, kind of like Moore's law. Like every X amount of years, you get for half the price, you get twice the quality of equipment. So it's getting cheaper, right? And I think just as a baseline, audio quality is the first thing audio and video quality, because I think people being able to see you is nice, but you shouldn't compromise audio quality, because some people might just be listening. And we have this conversation with health kits where it doesn't have to be professional grade. There's a threshold where the the quality of the audio becomes a distraction from the conversation. That threshold is actually not at a really high level. It's really just like, you can buy a USB mic for $100. You can buy a better webcam than your laptop has for probably like $150. So $250 is like literally the setup required, which can be used for many other virtual conferencing things. But for a podcast, that gives you a baseline level of quality. And I think the space you're in, really, it's just like, try and go into a space where you have some control over the background noise level. And that's pretty much it. Like, just have a baseline level of quality agreement between you and the other person. And that's pretty much it so that should not be an obstacle for anyone. Although I created that obstacle for myself a lot initially. Looking back, it's like nowadays with what's available, shouldn't be an obstacle.
Okay, Nick. So I have this. This is my microphone. It's the same one I use for my broken Android phone.
Nice.
And I have an HP laptop. And I just want you to evaluate my sound quality right now.
It sounds great. So I take back what I just said, because now there's new information. You don't need anything other than just like your video quality is great. I can hear you perfectly.
Zoom. That's Zoom. And I know that I went into the university. This is not my mansion. But I put all the light up because I was like, because I know that I love all those beams in your background. And I'm like, if I'm going to podcast with my friends from TFC, I want to at least have the illusion that I know what the hell I'm doing.
You do know what you're doing. Like, you forever think you're tech and competent, but like you're a wizard now. It's fun. Yeah.
I know, but I want to just say this because like, if you have it, because like, I just, you always say like, you don't have to hold that thing up. Like how I'm always like, Nikki, can you hear me? But so I have like, and I haven't been able to, the only reason why I haven't upgraded is because I don't want to have all the tech equipment around. And also I have like, no patience with like learning it, right? So when you said USB microphone, I'm like, oh shoot, I'm gonna have to freaking go and look. But I think like, at least just if you have like a set of microphone and a phone, like you could theoretically get going.
Yeah,
okay,
for sure.
So we have a baseline of sound equipment. But I think like background noise is an important thing, like you were saying, because people aren't necessarily going to be watching. And then like, how about like how you prep? Because we talked a lot. This was one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, because I was thinking like, how do you, I've made two mistakes so far where I've gotten on with somebody and I realized that like I hadn't done enough research, and I could feel that the conversation needed to end, because even though there was a lot to unpack, I wasn't adequately prepared because I hadn't done enough research that I wanted to do. So like, it's almost like you have to, it's such a great format, not only for sharing with the world, but also for reinforcing like what it is that you know about the topic that you want to discuss, and then like where your blind spots are. Like I think in the age where we always have our phones with us and we have access to information all the time, we think we know the things that the topics that we're passionate about discussing, but until you actually start to speak with another person live like this, it's a learning format too. Like you get to work your ideas out and see like how clear and how in depth you know the topic that you want to discuss. I think that's valuable feedback too, right?
Yes, that's extremely valuable. And I think you need to the clearer you go into the podcast, the clearer the podcast will be for people listening, right? If you kind of know like the macro topic of what you're going to talk about, but you have no idea like the subtopics and the order that you're going to talk about them in. Like basically when you're recording a podcast, there's different kinds of podcasts, right? There's ones where it's primarily storytelling, which like you just have to tell your story. And believe it or not, getting concise and clear on what your story is and how to tell it. Storytelling is a craft. And it's like, some people have great stories. They're not good at telling them. Some people are just amazing storytellers, and it really captivates people where people like just want to listen. So there's a storytelling podcast. There's one where you're unpacking a concept with the hopes of simplifying and giving practical guidance. And for those, you're basically engineering a journey, right? You're bringing people along this path. The path has to be coherent, where you're like following almost like a flow. You start with the big topics, and then you kind of dip your feet into the specifics, but then you always make sure to kind of bring it back towards the whole. Instead of just covering a bunch of random things, you want to make sure there's some flow to the conversation. And that's where writing down your thoughts, writing down, like I sequence subtopics based on the most important ones to cover, the least important ones to cover, because it's better to pick a topic and do it justice and kind of talk about it for whatever length you want than to try and rush through 10 of them and cover them like in a very shallow way. So I think of podcasts as a way to deeply explore topics rather, with context and nuance, and to really be curious, right? Like the person you're speaking to, are you interviewing them, or are you sharing information back and forth, right? Because if you're interviewing someone, it's more just like have a bunch of really good questions. Even if you know the answer to those questions, if that person is really good at explaining this topic, your role is to extract a really good flow and simplified version of this topic by having the right questions prepared. So are you telling a story? Are you unpacking a complex topic? Are you having a discussion, like a dialogue, where you have one perspective, the other person has a different one? You're trying to figure out, like, I want to know that person's information. They probably want to know mine. Let's figure out a synthesis of like, what is the actual truth based on both our perspectives? So having clarity on like, who is this podcast with? Who's going to be, who am I trying, who is this, who's the listener of this podcast, right? And also just like being really clear on what you want to talk about, because then you focus less on, am I talking about the right things during the podcast? And you focus just on having the conversation, because you know-ish where the flow is going to go. And I think the really conversations that I felt really good about were the ones I went in with the most clarity. And so I think preparing in advance, doing your research, which really most of the research is writing down what you currently know and structuring it into chunks that kind of fit together, so that you're not just saying everything without any structure. So I think and it's a really good exercise. Like, I think I love learning. And I think my favorite thing about podcasts was that it forced me to engage with a block of structured learning so that I could convey a topic, hopefully with more clarity, by just gaining that clarity myself. Right. And so, a lot of people are like, oh, you talk about knee pain and it's so smooth. It's like, well, there's like several hours preparing to try and be smooth in my delivery. That's not just like off the top of my head. And so I think the work that you put in behind the scenes is what people typically don't see. But when you start to do that, you will amaze yourself with how much clarity you can get and convey in a podcast by just putting more work in beforehand.
So the timing, like you were saying that you probably put 2 hours of not just like strictly research, but I found, like, just from your guidance, like when I would go to talk to you and I would want to have questions, like I had resistance to writing stuff down. But once I sat down and actually did that, it did make a big difference, because then you could like focus on what the person is saying and you kind of know where the conversation is going. So the natural questions would just come, rather than if you didn't prepare in advance, it seems like it's a little more choppy. Like you don't exactly know where to start, like it's a meandering path and you don't really know like where you're headed. So like I think writing things down was like the number one thing for me. Like it made me realize, like, what is the most important thing that I want to ask, or if I was interviewing, or that I want to say. And then you also said, oh, what was I was going to ask you, like you so what is the amount of time, like I guess like keeping it simple, keeping the topic that you want to, like when you're just starting, like one of the things I realized was that like sometimes I was like, this is overwhelming, too much, like I can't keep all of it straight, I can't keep the person on the screen, I can't stay focused on like the flow and then the timing. So it seems like keeping the first few podcasts like super simple, right? And then building into timing. So I was asking you about the difference between a 30-minute podcast and like a 90-minute podcast. Like, sometimes it just flies by and you're in the conversation and it's all really relevant. And then sometimes it's like, it's going really like on a meandering path that doesn't really have a focus or like a wrap up or clarity. So what's the difference between like a 30-minute podcast and a 90-minute podcast for you?
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about like harnessing the energy of a conversation as well. And this is just like the first time you do it, just like the first time you do anything, you're not supposed to be good at it. Like the whole point is you get better the more you do. And I think by listening to podcasts, you kind of absorb the anatomy of a good podcast, right? They have an intro, they ease into a topic, they talk about a topic, then they have like an ending, and there's like concise chapters, right? It's like an essay. And I think a lot of times when you're there's always like an interviewer and an interviewee. As much as there will be like a bi-directional conversation, there's always someone that kind of knows where the bus is going, right? And can kind of, if the bus goes off-roading and starts to get a little bit wacky, you can kind of reel it back in, right? Whether that's based on time, whether that's based on the relevance to the topic that you kind of said you were going to deliver. And so you gotta being really clear on what you're trying to do lets you determine when it's getting off the rails. And sometimes you just gotta make a judgment and be like, being off the rails is actually way better than being on the rails. Let's just go with it. So it's like,
Nikki Pop, I have this vision in my head though, like I'm driving the bus and you're in the back seat going like, maybe you should go left here. Maybe take a left, Ruth. Take a left.
Don't doubt yourself. Don't doubt yourself. Wherever, if Ruth's driving the bus, then my rationale is like, I don't care what happens, I'm gonna buckle up and we're going. So being clear and like, I'm starting to appreciate actually more and more, like the TFC audio project it actually gets a surprising amount of people listening to it. But to really set yourself apart in the podcasting scene, I think, there was almost an option for the audio project to be quote unquote remastered, where it's like, okay, someone takes an episode, they dissect it into 10-minute clips, which capture a certain concept. Then they dissect it into like 30-second clips for Instagram. So we can build this like journey of like, okay, this captivates someone's attention. This is the midpoint where like someone doesn't want to tune into the whole conversation for 2 hours, but maybe we get them interested or we give them one little snippet of valuable information with this. So I'm starting to learn the value of different timestamps for how long a piece of content is. But in general, like I like to do 2-hour conversations, like 90 to 120 minutes is like my sweet spot, because you kind of, if it's with someone you've never met before, never spoken to in person, like you need like 20 minutes just to warm up to them, to figure out like, how does this person, what are this person's mannerisms? Like, do they, like it really is. I love the craft of podcasting, because part of it is just being a good communicator means working to understand how the other person flows through a conversation and trying to almost like dance with them so that both of your styles meet up. And sometimes that means you have to accommodate your style to the other person. Right? I've done podcasts where people are really intense, and my job is to sort of like bring the energy back down so that it doesn't get crazy. Some conversations, people talk for long periods of time and they actually pause for thoughts before they're done finishing a point. You have to be aware of that, or else you're just going to interrupt and stop their flow of thinking. And I'm still working on this, right? I have my 3 worst habits are I say, I interrupt people. And when people are speaking, I go, because I'm actually listening, but then I listen to them, I'm like, fuck, stop doing that. It's so annoying. So I mean, there's a certain level of self-criticism that is healthy, and there's a certain level that's unhealthy, and only each individual can find out what that is for them. But one thing I always do is I listen to my own podcast, not every one of them anymore, but initially I listened to every single one of them, which was painful because no one likes to hear themselves talk. But I think it's important to notice the things that you do and then build a little bit of self-awareness for how you can improve on them moving forward. Like one thing I used to always write down is, what's one thing I got really annoyed with myself in this podcast? What's one thing I really liked that I did? And then just keeping like a little logbook of that, you get to read it. And before a podcast, maybe I'll take a glance at some of those, be like, okay, I'm going to work on that this time. And the more natural podcasting feels, the more extra bandwidth there is to like focus on those things. So a 30-second podcast to me is like, you're trying to do like you're trying to get a point across, right? Because 30 minutes
like a 30-second podcast.
30 minutes, sorry. 30 minutes is
30
like
seconds. You're like, I'm just going to say,
yeah. That's a tough one. That's just like a little audio clip, soundbite. A 30-minute podcast is to do a small, narrow topic, or like clear some confusion up. For example, like I've done some social media posts that were misconstrued. People got really angry. I would do like a 30-minute podcast, just like, I'm going to clear up some of the context around my perspective that went into this post, because just this little picture in text is clearly not being interpreted the way that I wanted to express it. But really I think conversations are really the sweet spot for podcasts. I mean, check-ins are kind of like a podcast, and they're like 10 minutes. It's just like pick one little tiny topic and just kind of share my thoughts on that topic. I don't know if people enjoy listening to them, but for me, they're actually a really powerful way to clarify. Like, I know before I do a check-in, I'm going on a half-hour walk and I'm going to think through, what do I want to talk about? Is this even something that I should be talking about? Do I know enough about this to give people valuable information? And if so, then it's like, okay, well, how can I unpack this topic in a way that simplifies it and lets people know how I think of this thing so that they can match that up to their information? So, but yeah, conversations that are like hour and a half to 2 hours gives you enough time to cover. And I've done like 3-hour podcasts, which are great, but they're pretty draining. And I think one thing with podcasts is if I know I have a podcast with someone that's going to go for a couple hours, I will clear 2 hours before and like an hour after. Like, it's a 2-hour podcast is a 5-hour thing. It's like an afternoon, because beforehand I want to get really clear on what I'm thinking. And afterwards, like, I'm like juiced out. I just need to go for a walk or relax, because it is actually really energy intensive to have a conversation where you're actively listening, trying to bring out information. Like, it's intense. So I think there's something to be said about starting with small podcasts. I didn't. Well, I kind of did with the Footcast, where they were like 20 or 30 minutes. But as long as both people are on the same page, so that they both know, okay, we're going to do 30 minutes. The objective is to whatever. And then if both people are clear and kind of have some little bit of framework for like what we're going to cover and the order that we're going to cover it in, I think that would resonate with people, because people's attention spans are shrinking more and more and more. So.
Yeah, so like maybe as a recap, we can talk about, like, just to start the recap, talking about the value of the podcast. And you just touched on how people's attention spans are really shrinking. And it seems to me that more and more people don't have the ability to truly listen to another human being while they're speaking and sharing themselves, because I just keep running into this more and more, where like people will get up and walk away to do something, and we don't mean to do this to each other, where we're just frantically going about our lives and not paying close attention to one another. And it seems to me that the podcast, people really do appreciate listening to podcasts, but I would also argue that making a podcast, like actually sharing conversation and information with another human via this platform, is so nourishing. At least that's the experience that I've had, because like I've said before, like I've never even met any of the foot nerds, and they're some of the closest relationships that I've had, because we have set aside time on Zoom to actually listen to each other and then share ourselves with each other without any distractions. And I think that is one of the real benefits of having this technology to do that with. And so I just want to encourage people, if they have any inkling to do it, to share these conversations, because it does end up being a bit of storytelling and like letting the human side of who we are come out in a time when we really need to see humanity for like the humanness that we have inside of us, rather than just always like freaking the F out about what's going on around us. And I just think it's a really good opportunity to share our lives, outside of just whatever we're doing in our cars and work and stuff. So maybe we could just like wrap it up by having you recap like the anatomy of what a beginning good podcast could be, and then like the way that you could, if you find that you really like it, what the next steps to getting more involved, like upgrading and your audio equipment and stuff like that.
Yeah, and even the audio equipment is like semantics. If you want better audio equipment, then we can even create a list within the Footner program to say like these, Clayton's got a ton of this stuff because he does a lot of content creation. So that information could come out if people have questions. But I think some of the key points for me, literally take a piece of paper and spend 30 minutes writing down your thoughts about the podcast. So write down everything you could potentially cover. Like, this is the topic I want to cover. These are subcomponents of that topic. These are questions I want to ask. These are like the things I want to simplify. Like, what am I trying to do with this conversation? I'm not just recording a conversation. I'm thinking things through to make sure that this is clear, coherent, and has a good flow. On the back of it, write 3 blocks, right? Intro. Believe it or not, I used to always get messed up on intros because it's like the least important part, right? You're just introducing you and the person, and you're literally welcoming people to this space that they're about to listen to. And by getting messed up on that, it messed up my flow for the whole conversation. So literally, I would write down my intros. Welcome to TFC Audio Project. I'm Nick. We're talking about this, and I'm speaking with this person. Thanks for being here. Let's start with this and have your first point. And if you started off smooth, the rest of the conversation is going to go more smooth. So on one side of the paper, get clear, write down, do a brain dump. On the other side, write down intro, literally write it down, and even say it to yourself a few times. And then write body, and write down the topics, but order them with some sort of flow. So look back on the other side of the page and say like, okay, these are big topics. These are subtopics. Which ones are the most important? Because however many you think you can cover, cut it in half and actually cover that many, because time flies when you're having a conversation. And then kind of write down at the end, like an ending, right? Like you want to bookend the conversation and say, I think that's good for today. We covered all these things, maybe do a little bit of a recap. I think finishing with some sort of tangible, practical advice, if it's more of a teaching and learning kind of topic podcast. And then just say, thanks for listening. See you later. And it's like literally knowing that is the anatomy of a podcast and how to really get clear on the body of what you're going to talk about, and then listening to them and just being critical enough that you're trying to constantly improve your craft at having conversations that are recorded, but not so critical that you're like, oh, I suck, I shouldn't do this. Everyone that has some information that can be of value to the world and can tell a story. And if you put in the work to talk about this concept and you haven't heard anyone talk about it with a lot of clarity before, there's probably some value in recording that and offering it to the world. Like, it's like you're creating the work you're putting in is to put together a gift to put out into the world to hope that some people get benefit from it. Mm-hmm. And I think everyone, we talked about this before we started recording, but like, there's only one Ruth O'Donnell on planet Earth. So if you just are yourself and you're not trying to copy other people, then you will do something that's never been put out into the world before. And someone will resonate with Ruth O'Donnell's situation and what you have to say. And so just know you have valuable information from your life experience. It's work to put together a good conversation on a podcast. Anyone can do it, and everyone will get better if they commit to wanting to do it more frequently and going. It's like a process, right? Mm-hmm. And once you get by the fear of that first episode and you're not too critical, like, it actually becomes a lot of fun, because I enjoy the conversations that I have on podcasts, because I can connect to anyone on planet Earth who I can reach out to and actually, and who is willing to have to do a podcast. And so, yeah, I mean, there's unlimited obstacles you can put in front of you, but at the end of the day, if you have something valuable to say and you find purpose in having conversations for the sake of putting out information that other people might find valuable, you should do it. Mm-hmm.
I love that you said it's putting a gift into the world. I think that's like a really great way of thinking about it, like offering a gift, Mm-hmm. And I think that's good for today, Nick.
I think so too. Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, maybe we should maybe you have something to say to the foot nerds, like, before we head out for the day. I don't know, any parting words?
I love you all. You're all amazing humans. I don't care who you are. If you are a foot nerd, you self-select yourself because you're an amazing, unique human being. You all have stories to tell that I personally love to hear them in the application videos, and I know other people would too. So any foot nerd who wants to do a podcast, I am here to help in any way I can. And yeah, thank you for making this what it is. And thank you, Ruth. Like, Ruth doesn't get enough credit for how much work she puts in and how good she is at weaving together this community of beautiful, magical misfits from around planet Earth who are healthy AF. She does a great job. So thank you, Ruth, for suggesting this today and for, being a great tribe mama.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's like a true pleasure. It's like really, really my true love. I love you guys too. I love all of y'all. And we will catch you in the next one. And hopefully, if you have any questions, or you want to like give us feedback, or you want to like have a podcast with us, you know where to find us. Okay. Ciao for now.
Ciao.